In this video we're going to continue solving quadratics, but this time we're going to first talk about a procedure called completing the square, and then we'll talk about the quadratic formula. Alright, so on the screen you see that I have x squared plus 8x plus 16, and back in the days when you were learning about factoring, this had a fancy name called a perfect square trinomial. Right underneath it I have it factored into a binomial squared, and this is a very important concept to keep in mind when we complete the square. So what does it mean when we complete the square? Well, we start out with two terms, so let's just say x squared plus 8x, and you're going to find the third term so that it can be written as a binomial squared. So in other words, you're going to start out with two terms, add a third term so that when you factor it, you get a binomial squared. Alright, so the procedure to do this is fairly simple. You look at the coefficient of the middle term, or the coefficient of the linear term, the x, and you take half of it and you square it. Okay, so half of 8 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. Okay, and when you add the 16, you now have found that value that we say completes the square. All right, let's do one more before we show how this is used to solve quadratics. So let's go ahead and let's look at one with a minus sign. So x squared minus 20x. And we're looking for this number here that would complete the square. I'll pause here for a moment to see if you can figure that out. Just as a reminder, we're taking half of the middle term and squaring it. And so half of negative 20 is negative 10, and negative 10 squared is 100. If we rewrite it as a binomial squared, we get this. Okay? All right. So how does this work? How do we solve a quadratic function? How do I find the x-intercepts of a quadratic function using the completing the square method? So here's my quadratic. I've got x squared minus 6x minus 7 equals 0. Now I want to remind you that factoring, if it's possible, is always the fastest way to find solutions. Okay? If you're good at factoring and a quadratic is factorable, then that's the way you want to go. But sometimes you can't factor it, or you don't see the factors. So we're going to do this method. So the first thing we do is we write the x squared minus the 6x, and then we're going to complete the square on that. And then we move the minus 7 to the other side by adding it. Okay, so step one is to move whatever constant is there to the right side. The next thing is to figure out this value that would complete the square. And the number that completes the square on a negative 6, take half of it, square it. Hopefully you see 9. Now this is really important. Because it's an equation and we're always talking about balance, whatever we add on the left, we have to add on the right as well. Okay, so I'm going to now rewrite the x squared minus 6x plus 9 as x minus 3 squared, and that's equal to 16. So we've learned before that when we have equations like this, that the way we solve it is we take the square root of both sides. So square root of both sides gives me x minus 3, and this is really important. Don't forget the plus or minus. Okay, so now I add 3 to both sides, and I get 3 plus or minus 4, and 3 plus 4 is 7, and 3 minus 4 is negative 1. And so those are the solutions to this quadratic equation. Okay, how did that go? Perfect. Let's do one now that has an odd number for the middle term, because we have to deal with fractions, and that can sometimes be a little tricky. Alright, so let's go ahead and look at x squared minus 7x plus 3 equals 0. Alright, so just to review the steps, step one is always to move that the constant, the third term of the quadratic, over to the other side. Okay. Now this is going to be trickier because when we take half of negative 7, we get negative 7 halves. I want to warn you that you'll be doing these without a calculator, so I want you to get in the habit of squaring the fraction and not squaring 3.5, because I really don't want anybody to do this by hand, right? That's not the method. What I'd like you to do is square the top and get 49, square the bottom and get 4. Okay, you're probably are noticing that when you complete the square, because the last thing you do is square it, that this term here, this third term, is always positive. So because we added 49 over 4 on the left side, we're going to add it again on the right side. All right, so now we're going to write this as a binomial squared. All right, so what goes here? Well, it turns out that this thing that we right before we squared it, that's the second term of the binomial. So you could check your work just to make sure. We would never ever ask you to factor something like this, but we can go from this perfect square trinomial to this because we know what we use to get there. Okay, and then on the right side we're going to find a common denominator, which would be 4, so I'd have negative 12 over 4 plus 49 over 4, and when I add those together I get x minus 7 halves squared equals 37 over 4. Again, square root of both sides, I get x minus 7 halves equals plus or minus square root of 37 over 2, and then last step is to move that 7 halves over. And this is a perfectly acceptable answer here. You don't need to split it up like we did in the last one. Okay, 2 examples of completing the square. As always, when we get to class, we'll practice a lot more of those. I just want to mention very quickly the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula is a third method to solve a quadratic. Okay, and like factoring, we start out, let's do an example here, 2x squared minus 4x minus 3 equals 0. We want to make sure in order to use the quadratic formula that the quadratic is equal to 0. Sometimes you have to move things, and then it's just a matter of remembering that the general form of a quadratic is ax squared plus bx plus c, and so identifying the a, the b, and the c helps us to plug into the formula. And I imagine most of you still have this memorized from your middle school algebra. So here we go. Opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a gives us our solutions. Okay, so here I'm going to go ahead and plug in this a, b, and c. So here's the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Okay, and then what we do is we clean up the inside. 16 minus, that turns out to be a negative 24, so we get 40 under the root over 4, and then it is an expectation because you've had enough reducing radicals that you could rewrite this as 4 plus or minus 2 root 2 root 10 over 4. And then because we have a 4, 2, and a 4 there, we can factor it out. Final answer, 2 plus or minus root 10 over 2, and those are your 2 solutions. Now, of course, if I asked you to graph that, I'd give you a calculator so that you could get a better sense of what decimals those are close to. Okay, great. 2 more methods to solve quadratic equations. We'll see you in class and get a chance to practice this.